Nora Sevidge, used the last of her money to buy a derelict cider press and 43 bushels of half-frozen crabapples that nobody else wanted, and the men at the cold water auction yard laughed loud enough that she could still hear them when she reached the road. They said she'd lost her mind along with her husband. They said the old Sevidge property up on the Ash Creek bench would be somebody else's land before the thaw came through in April. What they didn't know was that Nora had been calculating for 6 months. She'd been watching and reading and turning something over in her mind since the summer, and the thing she'd turned over had become something solid. This is the story of a woman who took what everyone else had written off and made it into something people drove 2 hours out of their way to find, and what it cost her to get there. The morning of the Coldwater Fall auction, Nora Sevidge was awake before 5. She lay in the dark of the upstairs bedroom, listening to the wind off the Cypress Hills, moving through the spruce line at the back of the property, a sound she'd known since childhood, since her father had run cattle on this same benchland and she'd grown up sleeping under its particular rhythm. The wood stove had gone cold. She could feel the October chill sitting in the floorboards the way it settled in this part of Saskatchewan, patient and deliberate, not the sudden bite of a January storm, but the kind of cold that moves in and makes itself comfortable and doesn't apologize for it. She was 31 years old. Her husband Garrett had died 14 months ago in a machinery accident on a property 40 kilometers east. A man who'd worked hard his whole life and left behind a quarter section of benchland, a daughter named Faye, who was 9, and lived with Garrett's mother in Swift Current during the school week, and a debt on the farm equipment that was larger than the value of the equipment itself. The cattle they'd run together she'd sold that spring to cover the first note that came due. The second note was due in March. The number on it was $3,800, and Nora had no clear path to that number unless she sold the bench land itself, which was the only thing she absolutely would not do. She'd grown up on this property. She knew every acre of it the way you know a place when you've walked it in every season, since you could walk far. She knew the south-facing slope above the creek where the wild Saskatoons grew thick, and the crabapple trees her great-aunt had planted in the 1940s still produced each fall, small hard fruit, tart, and not worth picking for eating, but they produced. She knew the old stone root cellar her grandfather had dug into the hillside, cool and dry and consistent in a way that no modern refrigerated building could quite replicate. And she knew the cider press, an old rack and cloth unit from the 1950s that had sat in the machinery shed since her father's time, neglected but structurally intact, cast iron main frame, wooden rack frames that had warped but could be replaced, a pressing plate her father had kept clean and covered in burlap. The press was the thing she kept coming back to. She'd been coming back to it since August, when she'd spent an afternoon on the Ash Creek bench sorting through her great-aunt's papers in the house and found a bundle of order receipts from the 1960s. Her great-aunt had run a small cider operation for 12 years. The receipts showed sales to 3 hotels in Swift Current, 1 in Medicine Hat, and a restaurant supplier in Moose Jaw. The numbers were from another era in dollar terms, but the volume told a story. A small operation producing something specific had found buyers willing to come back for it, season after season, for more than a decade. She'd looked at the press with different eyes after that. The Coldwater auction was held every October at the community yard at the edge of town, a spread of gravel and corrugated steel shelters that smelled of diesel exhaust, and the particular tension of people trying to sell what they'd decided they didn't need. Nora arrived early and walked the lot before the bidding started. The press was listed under miscellaneous farm equipment, along with an old grain auger, a set of wooden apple crates that had seen better days, and 43 bushels of crabapples from Len Tworek's property east of town that Tworek wanted moved because he'd decided the trees were more trouble than they were worth. She'd looked at the crabapples the week before, when Tworek had let it be known he was liquidating the lot. She'd spent time with the fruit the way she spent time with anything she was seriously considering, which was longer than most people thought was necessary and shorter than she actually needed. The apples were small and dense, high in tannin, the kind of fruit that commercial processors passed over because the yield per bushel was lower than eating varieties. But the acidity was extraordinary. She'd cut several open and tasted the flesh standing in Tworek's cold storage, and the flavor had been sharp and layered in a way that made her think of the cider her great-aunt had kept in the root cellar in quart jars, a product she'd tasted as a child and never quite stopped thinking about. The auctioneer, a stocky man named Devereaux, who ran the cold water sales 3 times a year, started the crabapple lot at $8 a bushel, and nobody moved. He dropped to 6. Still nothing. He looked around the yard in the way of a man who has auctioned enough things to know when a lot has already been decided by the crowd. $4 a bushel for the lot. Any takers? Nora raised her hand. The yard did what yards do. It paused for a moment, and then someone laughed, and then the laughter spread in that loose, easy way of people who are surprised and don't particularly mean any harm by it. Devereaux looked at her with the careful attention he gave to all bids he wasn't sure about. The whole lot, he said. 43 bushels. And the press, too, if you'll put them together. More laughter. The press had been sitting unsold for 2 auction cycles. Devereaux knocked it down to her for a combined price that cleaned out the small emergency fund she'd been keeping in an envelope in the kitchen drawer. She borrowed the balance, $220, from her neighbor Agnes Flatt, who ran a small mixed farm 2 kilometers up the road and had known Nora since she was small, and who handed over the money from her own kitchen drawer without asking for a written agreement or a repayment schedule, only saying, "Spring, when you can," which was the way people talked on the Ash Creek bench when they meant it. Getting the press back to the property took most of an afternoon, and the cooperation of her late husband's cousin Boyd, who arrived with a flatbed and a come-along without being asked because Agnes had mentioned it to him at the gas station in Coldwater that morning. Boyd loaded the press in silence, drove it up the bench road, and helped Nora get it positioned inside the old implement shed without saying anything about whether he thought this was a good idea. He was a quiet man who expressed opinions through his availability or his absence, and he'd shown up, which said what it said. She stood in the shed that evening after Boyd had gone, looking at the press in the light of the single bulb that hung from the rafter, and she thought about the cost she'd just taken on, and the winter that was coming, and the debt note due in March, and the 43 bushels of crabapples she'd had trucked to the root cellar, and she felt the particular weight of a decision that can't be undone. It wasn't panic. It was more like the feeling of stepping off a bank into a river you've checked but haven't swum. She went back to the house and made tea and sat at the kitchen table with her great-aunt's receipts and a pad of paper and started working through the numbers. The first problem was the press itself. The cast-iron frame was sound, but the wooden rack frames had warped beyond use, and the pressing cloths were rotted out entirely. She'd need new frames built, new cloths sourced. She knew enough about woodworking from years of farm maintenance to build the frames herself if she had the right lumber. But the cloths were a specialized item, and she'd have to order them from a supplier in Ontario that she'd found through a home craft cider-making forum she'd been reading since September. The second problem was fermentation. Traditional farmhouse cider required wild yeast or a cultivated cider yeast and thyme, neither of which cost much, but both of which required vessels. She had 2 large oak barrels in the root cellar that had held her grandfather's homemade wine decades ago and had been sitting empty since. She inspected them in the first week of November. One was sound. One had a stave that had dried and shrunk away from its neighbor, leaving a gap that would need re-swelling or coopering. She spent 2 days re-swelling it with water and then vinegar water, checking daily, and by the end of the second week it was holding liquid. She pressed the first test batch in the second week of November. The pressing cloth had arrived from the Ontario supplier, addressed in careful handwriting that suggested someone who took their business seriously. The new rack frames she'd built herself from white ash lumber she'd gotten from the woodlot at the back of the property, cut and planed in the implement shed over several cold evenings. The pressing was physical work. She ran the apples through the hand-cranked mill she'd found in a box in the implement shed, a component she'd almost missed because it had been wrapped in burlap, and she'd assumed it was a spare part for something else. And then she built the rack, layering the milled apple pulp between the pressing cloths on the wooden frames, and she applied pressure slowly, the way her great-aunt's instruction sheet suggested. The juice that came out was dark gold, almost amber, with a smell that stopped her the first time she experienced it. Not sweet exactly. Complex, mineral, and orchard, and something underneath she didn't have a word for yet. She filled 3 mason jars from the first pressing and set them on the root cellar shelf, and looked at them in the lantern light for a moment before she went back to work. The oak barrel received the bulk of the first test pressing, sealed with an airlock she'd improvised from a rubber stopper and a bent piece of copper tubing, and she left it to ferment in the root cellar, where the temperature held between 4 and 8 degrees Celsius through the winter. Cold fermentation, slow fermentation. She'd read about it in 3 different places, and the principle was consistent. Lower temperature produced a slower, cleaner fermentation that preserved the delicate floral and fruit notes that warmer fermentation cooked off. The commercial operators used controlled temperature rooms. She had a stone cellar that her grandfather had dug 70 years ago and had never done anything but hold a steady temperature through the most extreme seasons this part of the country could produce. She thought that was probably enough. The first person to say something to her face about the auction was a man named Selby Hartwick, who farmed the flat quarter south of Coldwater and liked to make himself useful at the edge of other people's business. He came by in early December, supposedly to return a post-pounder he'd borrowed from Garrett 2 winters ago, and stood in the yard looking at the implement shed where a thin seam of light was visible under the door. "You got that old press running?" he said. "Working on it." He looked at the shed. "What are you making?" "Cider." He was quiet a moment. He had the expression of a man assembling a polite response to something he found impractical. "Crabapple cider. That's right. Those Twarek apples." He shook his head in a way that was its own complete sentence. He wasn't cruel about it. He sounded almost genuinely concerned. "Nora, those apples are too small and too sour. You're going to spend all winter pressing and fermenting, and what comes out won't be worth selling." "Worth selling to who?" she said. He paused. He hadn't been thinking in terms of selling. He'd assumed this was a hobby, a project to occupy a hard winter, the kind of thing widows did to keep their hands busy. "I have buyers in mind," Nora said. She said it more confidently than she entirely felt, because she had a contact in mind, not quite a buyer yet. She'd found, in the same bundle of papers as her great-aunt's receipts, a letter from a hotel provision supplier in Regina who had been sourcing specialty food products from small operations across the province. The letter was 30 years old, but the company name had appeared, after some searching, in a current trade directory, now operating as part of a larger food distribution network. She'd written to the address 3 weeks ago. She hadn't heard back. Hartwick left, and she went back to the implement shed and stood in the cold for a while thinking about the word worth, and what it did and didn't mean depending on who was using it. The winter was harder than the previous one. The snow came early in November and stayed, building on the bench until the road to Coldwater became something to plan around rather than take for granted. Nora moved through those weeks on a routine she'd built around the limitations of a single person managing a farm, a fermentation process, and a daughter who came home on alternate weekends and needed regular life to be as regular as Nora could make it. Faye was 9, with the particular directness of a child who'd been through a hard thing and had developed a way of watching adults carefully before she trusted what they said. She helped when she was home. She fed the remaining 3 chickens Nora kept for eggs, and she helped haul wood, and she asked specific and practical questions about the cider that told Nora she'd been thinking about it between visits. "Is it going to be sweet or sour?" Faye asked, sitting on a crate in the implement shed one Saturday while Nora was adjusting the airlock on the second barrel. "Depends on how long we let it go. Longer is drier." "What do you want?" "Dry," Nora said. "That's what the good ones are." "How do you know what the good ones are?" She thought about the jars on the root cellar shelf, about the memory of her great-aunt's product, which she'd tasted once as a very young child, and retained as a sensory impression rather than a describable flavor, something that had been made carefully and tasted like it. "I know," she said. "I just need to get there." Faye considered this, and then climbed off the crate and went to help with something else, which was, Nora had learned, how her daughter expressed acceptance. She didn't argue with answers that made sense. January brought 3 weeks of temperatures that stopped the road traffic and pushed the cold through the walls of the implement shed, despite the insulation she'd stapled to the framing in November. The root cellar held its temperature without complaint. She went down every day to check the fermentation, pressing her ear against the barrel stave and listening to the slow activity inside, which told her nothing scientific but told her something. The liquid was working, doing what it was meant to do. She'd tasted a sample in late December, and the flavor had been green and sharp in a way she recognized as early, unfinished, not where it needed to be, but pointing in the direction she wanted to go. She kept a notebook, a small one from the dollar store in Swift Current, with a red cover that she'd been using since November. She wrote down pressing dates, temperatures, tasting notes, and the adjustments she made. She was not a formally trained producer. She'd learned from her great-aunt's papers, from the online forums she read on her phone in the evenings, from 2 library books she'd gotten through interlibrary loan from the Swift Current branch, and from the thing she'd trusted most consistently throughout her adult life, which was close attention to what was actually in front of her, rather than what someone said should be. Her great-aunt's notes had mentioned that the best batches had a second characteristic she'd called depth. She hadn't explained it further in anything Nora found, only the word underlined once, next to a production date in 1967. Nora had thought about that underline through most of the winter. She'd decided it meant something that came from time, specifically, and from the particular quality of the Ash Creek bench crabapples, which nobody in commercial production had ever found worth pursuing, and which she now thought was possibly the point. Agnes came up the road in the last week of January, the way she'd been coming up the road her whole life, without announcement, in a truck that had over 300,000 kilometers on it, and smelled of dog and spilled coffee. She set a covered dish on the kitchen table, and sat down without being asked and looked at Nora with the sharp, clear attention of a woman who had raised 4 children alone after her husband's accident, and recognized the signs of someone running on too little sleep. "You're losing weight," Agnes said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I said." Agnes was past the age of diplomatic indirection and had always been past it, as far as Nora could remember. She was 64 and had the kind of face that had stopped being careful about what it showed. She ate the food she'd brought. She talked about the cider. She asked the specific questions that told Nora she'd been thinking about it since the fall. "What are you planning to charge?" Agnes said. "I haven't decided. Don't undercharge." Agnes said it with the flat certainty of someone who'd seen that mistake made. People pay for what they understand. If you price it cheap, they'll think it's cheap. Nora had been thinking about this for weeks. She'd looked at the retail prices for artisanal ciders from producers in the Okanagan and in Ontario and in Quebec. What she was making was different from most of what she found: drier, more particular, slower fermented. Whether that translated to a price premium, she didn't know yet. She needed someone to taste it first. The letter from the provisions contact arrived in the second week of February, not from the original address she'd written to, but from a woman named Delphine Rougier, who was a specialty food buyer for a regional distribution company that supplied independent restaurants and hotels across Saskatchewan and southern Alberta. Rougier had received Nora's letter forwarded through 2 offices. She wrote in a clear business style, no preamble, and said she was passing through the Cypress Hills region in mid-March and would stop if Nora had product ready to taste. Nora read the letter twice standing in the kitchen in her coat because she'd just come in from the shed. Then she put it on the kitchen table and made coffee and sat down and looked at it for a while. She went to the root cellar and took a sample from the barrel. She stood in the cold with the sample jar and tasted it slowly. The greenness was gone. The sharpness was still there, but had resolved into something more structured, a dryness that finished clean, and underneath it, something else, the thing her great-aunt had called depth. It wasn't all the way there yet. She thought it needed another 4 to 6 weeks. But it was on its way. It was pointing somewhere she recognized as right, without being able to say precisely how she knew. She wrote back to Rougier that same afternoon and confirmed March. And then she went back to the implement shed and pulled out the second notebook she'd been keeping, the one with the detailed temperature logs and pressing records. And she went through everything she'd done since November, looking for the things she'd do the same and the things she'd change. February ran cold, and then, in its second week, cracked open for 3 days of above-zero temperatures that softened the road and let the light back into the yard in a way that felt almost unreasonable. Nora used those days for outside work she'd been deferring, split wood, checked the cellar ventilation, walked the orchard on the south slope and assessed the trees. There were 31 trees. 8 of them were in poor condition, old and winter damaged, not producing at useful levels. The rest were in varying states of health, some better than she'd expected, A few she hadn't paid close enough attention to. She made notes. She'd need to prune in late March, and she'd need to decide which trees were worth nursing along and which weren't, a decision she kept approaching and setting aside. She thought about her great-aunt, who had planted most of these trees herself, who had done it without any particular plan for a large operation, the same way her grandfather had dug the root cellar, the same way her father had kept the cider press clean and covered in burlap even when he had no use for it, doing things carefully for reasons that weren't fully articulable, but amounted to a belief that the land held possibilities that hadn't been found yet. Agnes came back to check on her in the third week of February, and this time she brought her daughter-in-law Wren, who worked as a bookkeeper for 3 small businesses in Swift Current, and had a mind for numbers that Agnes had decided Nora needed access to. Wren was 36, practical, with reading glasses she pushed up onto her head when she wasn't using them and pulled down to look at things she was. She looked at Nora's notebook with the glasses down. "You're underestimating your cost per bottle," Wren said. "I thought I was being conservative. Your labor isn't in here." "Not seriously." Wren tapped the page. "You're doing every step of this yourself. Pressing, racking, bottling, labeling. That's not free." They worked through it at the kitchen table for 2 hours while Agnes made something on the stove. By the end of it, Nora had a real production cost number and a real minimum price per bottle and a suggested retail price that was higher than she'd been thinking. Higher by enough that it made her uncomfortable in the way that being right makes you uncomfortable when you've been wrong for a while. If someone drives up that road in March to taste this, Wren said they're not coming for something ordinary. Price it like it isn't. Nora sat with that for a long time after they left. She sat with it in the root cellar that evening, standing in the lantern light with her notebook, the slow cold of the stone walls around her, and the smell of fermentation in the air, apple and yeast and something older underneath, the smell of the cellar itself, which had been holding things in the dark since her grandfather's time. She wrote a number at the top of a clean page. She looked at it for a while. She didn't change it. Rouget arrived on a Wednesday in the third week of March, later than planned, because the highway east of Maple Creek had been icy that morning, and she'd had to come a longer way. She drove a company truck with the distribution company name on the door panel, and she climbed out and looked at the root cellar entrance before she looked at anything else. "You age it in there?" she said. "All winter." Rouget walked to the cellar entrance and looked in without going down. She had the wind-burned look of someone who spent a lot of time on the road and the particular attention of someone who had bought food products from a lot of operations and knew what to look for. She tasted the cider in the root cellar, standing between the stone walls with a small glass Nora had brought down on a tray. She tasted it the way a professional tastes things, in stages, not performing it, just doing it. She was quiet for a moment after she'd finished. "This is not what I expected," she said. Nora waited. "I expected something rough. Farmhouse, amateur, well-intentioned but unfinished." Rouget looked at the glass. "This is finished." She set the glass down. "Where did you learn the process?" "My great-aunt ran an operation here in the 60s. I had her notes." Rouget looked at her steadily. "The notes got you here?" "The notes got me started. The winter got me here." Rouget picked up her glass again and looked at it. "How much per case?" Nora told her the number she'd written in the notebook. Rouget didn't negotiate. She said, "I can move 4 cases a month to start, through 2 restaurant accounts in Regina and 1 hotel in Moose Jaw. If those accounts reorder, and I think they will, I'll call you in May." She paused. "Can you scale it?" Nora thought about the orchard. The 31 trees, 23 of which were viable. She thought about the root cellar and its capacity. She thought about what scaling meant in terms of pressing time, fermentation vessels, and the physical limits of what she could do alone. "By next harvest," she said, "not before." Rouget nodded. She wrote something in her own notebook, the compact kind that people who move through a lot of supplier meetings carry. She looked around the root cellar once more before they went back up. "I've been looking for Saskatchewan product in this category for 2 years," she said. "Most small producers give me something that tastes like it was made by someone who figured it out halfway through." She capped her pen. "This tastes like it was figured out first." She left an hour later, back down the bench road toward the highway. Nora stood at the gate and watched the truck until it disappeared around the creek bend. Then she stood there a little longer because she needed a minute before she went back to work. Rouget's driver picked up the first 4 cases on a Thursday afternoon in early April, a week after the last real snow. He arrived in a refrigerated panel van, counted the cases, signed the receipt without discussion, and handed Nora an envelope containing the payment in full before the van was even loaded. She didn't open the envelope until he was gone. The amount was what Rouget had agreed to. She stood in the yard holding it, and then she went inside and put the money in the kitchen drawer and fed the chickens and checked the secondary fermentation she'd started in late February with the second barrel and got back to work. The rhythm that established itself through April was different from the winter's rhythm in a way she'd needed without knowing she needed it. She had a customer. She had an order date, the uncertainty of the previous 6 months, which had been a particular kind of productive uncertainty. The kind you carry when you're building something that doesn't exist yet, had resolved into a different kind of work, specific, scheduled, measurable. She brought the pruning under control through April, working the orchard in the mornings before the day's other work. She'd gotten a pair of loppers and a pruning saw from the hardware co-op in Coldwater, and she worked tree by tree, removing the deadwood and the crossing branches, opening the canopy the way the Extension Service pamphlet she'd read through Interlibrary Loan described. The 8 trees she'd assessed as poor in February, she pruned hard, not expecting a full harvest, only assessing how much life was left in them. 2 of them responded by the end of April in ways that suggested they'd been suppressed by the deadwood and might yet produce. Agnes came up one afternoon while Nora was in the orchard and stood at the fence watching her work. "Someone at the Coldwater Co-op asked me about you," Agnes said. "What kind of asking?" "Careful asking." She paused. Mabel Thorne's husband heard from someone in Regina that a product from up the Ash Creek bench was being served at the Wascana dining room. Nora climbed down from the stepladder she'd been using to reach the higher branches. She didn't know the Wascana dining room specifically, but she knew its category. That was one of Rouget's restaurant accounts. "What did you tell him?" she said. "That you were busy and not taking visitors." Agnes said it without apology. "You're not ready for visitors." "No," Nora said. "Not yet." Agnes looked at the orchard. "You need help," she said, not offering my opinion, just observing. Nora had known this for weeks and had been resisting it for the same reason she'd been resisting most things that required her to ask. She'd built this alone through the winter, and there was a particular pride in that, not vanity, something more functional, the pride of having verified that she could. It had taken her longer than it should have to understand that the verification was complete and the time for something else had begun. The person she'd been thinking about was a woman named Gretchen Dahl, who lived 5 kilometers up the bench with her teenage son, Oscar. Gretchen had been widowed 2 years before Garrett's accident in similar circumstances, a farming accident in harvest season, and she'd kept her property running through a combination of leasing some of the cultivated land and working part-time at the Coldwater Co-op. Nora had seen her at the Coldwater market through the summer, and she had the look of someone managing, but at the upper edge of what managing meant, holding it together with both hands. Nora went on a Saturday morning, when the road was dry enough to make the visit easy. Gretchen answered the door with the expression of a person interrupted in the middle of something necessary, which Nora recognized because she wore it herself most of the time. "I need help," Nora said. "I can pay for it. Can I come in and explain what I'm doing?" Gretchen stepped back from the door. Nora explained it at the kitchen table. The orchard, the press, the fermentation process, the order from Rouget, the orders she expected to come, what she needed, someone with agricultural knowledge who could help with the orchard maintenance and the harvest, and eventually the pressing, which was physical enough to need 2 people to run efficiently. She explained what she'd pay. It was a fair rate, and she said it plainly. She also offered a quantity of product, cases of cider at cost, which had practical value for a household running lean. Gretchen listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands on the table. "Oscar's good with trees," she said. "He did his junior ag project on orchard management. He's been looking for work that's actual work." "How old?" 16. She paused. "I know that sounds young. Does he actually know what he's doing, or did he get a good mark on the project?" Gretchen almost smiled. "He knows what he's doing." The mark was 72. Nora looked at her. The 72 was more persuasive than a higher number would have been. "Bring him Saturday," she said. Oscar arrived Saturday morning before his mother, which told Nora something. He was tall and quiet in the way of 16-year-old boys who've had to grow up faster than they planned. And he went straight to the orchard fence and looked at the trees before he said anything. He asked 4 questions in the first 10 minutes. All specific, all indicating he'd been thinking about what he was going to see before he got there. Gretchen arrived 20 minutes later and found them already in the orchard. Nora explaining the pressing schedule while Oscar made notes in a small book he'd brought from his back pocket. "Did you tell him to bring a notebook?" Gretchen said. "No," Nora said. Gretchen looked at her son and then at Nora. "That's just what he does." They were in the orchard until noon. Oscar identified 3 trees Nora hadn't assessed correctly. One she'd written off, that he thought had another decade of production in it if handled right, and 2 she'd considered viable that he thought were masking a root problem that would show in 2 years. He was specific about why, citing what he'd observed in the bark pattern and the branch structure, and Nora went back and looked at what he was pointing to and found he was right on all 3. She didn't say much about it in the moment. She adjusted her notes. The month of May moved in a way she hadn't anticipated, with a forward momentum that was different from the patient grinding of the winter. Rouget called in the second week of May. 2 of the 3 accounts had reordered. The third had passed an extra bottle around a kitchen meeting, and the chef wanted to know availability. Could Nora supply 6 cases a month instead of 4? She worked through the numbers that evening with Wren, who had become a regular presence at the kitchen table on the first Monday of each month, going through the production ledger with her reading glasses down and asking the kind of questions that needed asking. The 6-case volume was achievable from the current barrels. Beyond that, she needed more pressing capacity and more fermentation vessels. The fermentation vessel problem she'd been thinking about since April. The 2 oak barrels were the right kind of container, but she only had 2. New ones were expensive. Used wine barrels from the Okanagan could be sourced at a lower price, but the minimum order was 4 at a time, and the transport cost made it significant. She'd been looking at food-grade stainless fermentation tanks as an alternative, which were efficient and cleanable, but produced a different character in the cider, something she'd noticed in the side-by-side comparisons she'd run in April. The oak was doing something to the fermentation. She couldn't prove that scientifically with what she had available, only by tasting the result. She called a cooperative in Kelowna on a Thursday afternoon and asked about used barrels. The woman who answered, whose name was Sybil Gard, was the kind of person who asks more questions before quoting a price than you expect. And Nora answered all of them, and by the end of the call, Sybil said she had 4 barrels coming out of service from a winery client at the end of June. Medium toast French oak, 8 years old, which was not what Nora had been expecting to find. She paid a deposit that was larger than comfortable and arranged transport through a freight broker Agnes's son-in-law used. She didn't tell anyone except Wren about the deposit, and Wren said, "That's the right call," and then recalculated the production cost sheet to incorporate it. A letter arrived in the 3rd week of May from a provisions buyer at a hotel in Saskatchewan. He'd tasted the cider at the Wascana dining room while attending a conference and wanted to know Nora's terms for a regular allocation. He wrote formally, in the kind of precise language that came from professional habit, and his question about terms was specific. Not just price, but consistency of product across batches, delivery schedule, and minimum case count. She sat with the letter for an evening. Then she called Rouget. "I need to know if you're able to take on a Saskatoon account," Nora said, "or if I need to contact them directly." Rouget was quiet a moment. "What's the account?" She named the hotel. Rouget said, "That's a principal account. I'd want to represent that if you're agreeable." "Terms?" Nora said. Rouget named a commission structure. It was fair. They spent 20 minutes on the phone working through the details, and by the end of it, Nora had agreed to an allocation that was larger than what she was currently producing, contingent on the new barrels coming online in July. She hung up and sat in the kitchen with the production schedule in front of her, and looked at the gap between what she could currently make and what she'd just committed to making, and felt the particular sensation of having made a commitment that was achievable, but only if nothing significant went wrong. She went to find Gretchen. She'd gotten in the habit of thinking through operational problems with Gretchen in the same way she'd come to think through the financial side with Wren. Gretchen had a practical intelligence that was different from Agnes's or Wren's, less financial and more physical, an understanding of what was actually possible in a day's work on a specific piece of land with specific people. The Saskatoon commitment, Nora said, when they were sitting on Gretchen's porch that evening. I need the volume by August. Gretchen looked at the production schedule Nora had brought. August is tight, I know. The pressing is the constraint, not the fermentation. Pressing is slow when it's one person. Nora had already been thinking this. I need to double the pressing speed from July onward. That's either a larger press or 2 people on the current one. Gretchen was quiet for a moment. Oskar can operate the mill independently now. I've watched him. She folded her hands in her lap. If you had a second person on the press while he ran the mill, you could process twice the volume in the same hours. That second person being you, if the days work out. Gretchen looked at her directly. I need the schedule 2 weeks out to manage the co-op shifts. I can do that. They worked out the details with the same absence of drama that characterized how they'd built most of their working arrangement. There was no moment of decision exactly, just 2 people who'd both had to build things without much help deciding to be practical about needing each other. The 4 Kelowna barrels arrived in early July, on a flatbed that Oskar helped unload with the kind of efficient physical competence that Nora had come to expect from him. He'd measured the root cellar entrance the week before and confirmed the barrels would pass through, and they did, by 4 centimeters, which was not a margin that left room for error, but was enough. Gretchen had come up for the delivery, and she and Nora and Oskar maneuvered the barrels through the cellar entrance one at a time. A process that required specific angles that Oskar had worked out in advance on paper, and that proved correct. Once they were positioned and filled with a water rinse to reswell the staves, Nora stood in the root cellar with the 3 of them in the cool, and the lantern light, and the smell of old oak and something underneath it, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in that moment, which was that the root cellar her grandfather had dug now had twice the production capacity it had ever had in his time, or her great-aunt's time, and the people standing in it were 3 people she hadn't known at the start of the winter. She didn't say that. She said, "We start pressing next week," and they went back up into the July afternoon. The Saskatoon hotel allocation went out in August as committed. The delivery driver, a methodical man named Clive, who worked for the distribution company Rouget managed the account through, arrived with a refrigerated van and a signed order form and loaded 8 cases with the careful efficiency of a person who'd been driving product a long time and took the work seriously. He handed Nora the payment envelope before the van was locked. She went inside and opened it at the kitchen table. The amount was correct to the dollar. She put it in the ledger and then called Faye at her grandmother's, which was something she did every Sunday evening, and also whenever something happened that seemed worth marking. Faye asked 2 practical questions about the cider, one about the new barrels, and one about whether Oskar was going to come back in the fall, and Nora said yes to both, and they talked for 20 minutes about other things. She paid the first installment on the equipment debt in September, the week before Faye came home for the fall school term. The payment was $200 more than the minimum, which meant it would be retired 6 months ahead of the schedule the creditor had proposed. She sat in the creditor's office in swift current with the payment ready, and the man across the desk, whose name was Beaumont, and who had the cautious disposition of someone who'd seen too many farm debt situations go sideways, looked at the payment and then at her for a moment. "You're ahead of schedule," he said. "I know," Nora said. He processed the payment with the expression of a man recalibrating. He didn't say anything else about it. Neither did she. Faye started grade 5 at the Coldwater School in September, which meant she was home on the bench 5 days a week instead of 2 weekends a month. This change in the domestic schedule required adjustments on both sides. Faye was old enough to manage several things independently and did so without being asked, which Nora appreciated and didn't take for granted. She packed her own lunch, and she knew how to start the wood stove, and she kept her own room in the state she preferred, which was not precisely tidy, but was organized according to a system Nora had stopped questioning after she'd watched Faye find a specific library book in it in under 30 seconds. On a Saturday morning in early October, Faye went down to the root cellar by herself while Nora was in the orchard and came back up with one of the test jars from the current fermentation, the batch in the new Kelowna barrels. She set it on the kitchen counter. It smells different from the first ones, Faye said. Different how? She considered. More like the cellar. And something else, like outside. Nora opened the jar and smelled it. Faye was right. The oak was contributing something. A faint vanilla and spice note underneath the apple and the dry fermentation character. It was not fully developed yet. It needed 8 more weeks. But it was pointing somewhere she hadn't been before. She wrote it down in her notebook that afternoon, in the specific terms she now used for sensory assessment, terms she'd developed over the winter from the forums and the books, and from her own necessity to make her observations precise enough to be useful. When she finished writing, she read it back, and then she wrote at the bottom of the entry, "Oak batch, notable." She underlined it once. The way people in Coldwater spoke to her had shifted through the summer in a way she'd noticed without tracking precisely. Hartwick, who had predicted in December that nothing sellable would come from the Twarek apples, had said something at the co-op in August that was closer to a question than the statement he would have made the previous fall. Something about whether she'd considered expanding the orchard. She'd said she was considering it, and he'd nodded in a way that was its own kind of revision, the slow turning of a person who's decided to update their assessment without quite announcing it. Selby Hartwick came up the road on a Wednesday in late October, this time without any pretext. He came on foot, the way people came when they wanted to have a conversation rather than conduct a transaction. He had the hat-in-hands quality she'd seen on men who'd arrived at a position they hadn't expected to arrive at. "I have 12 trees," he said. "Old ones, heritage variety. Been on my property since my grandfather's time. I've been keeping them more out of habit than anything else." He looked at the orchard. "You might know what to do with them better than I do." Nora looked at him. "What do you want for them?" He named a number that was fair. She thought about what 12 trees in good condition, mature trees, already producing, would mean for the harvest next fall. "I'll take a look at them this week," she said. "If they're what you're describing, I'll pay what you're asking." She sent Oscar to look at them first. He came back and said 11 of the 12 were exactly what Hartwick had described, and one was in decline but not unsalvageable with the right work. He said it without editorializing, just the assessment, which was what she'd sent him to do. She went herself the following afternoon and confirmed what Oscar had found, because she'd learned to verify the things that mattered, regardless of how much she trusted her source. The trees were old and productive, and had been maintained with the particular unconscious care of someone who kept things going more from habit than intention, which was, she'd come to understand, one of the better ways to keep something alive. She paid Hartwick his price. They shook hands at the fence line. He looked at the trees for a moment with an expression that was more complicated than relief. The expression of a man who'd decided to let go of something and wasn't entirely certain how he felt about it. "They were here before I was," he said. It seemed right to find someone who was going to pay attention to them. She didn't say anything to that, but she held it. She understood it. She'd felt something similar about the root cellar, the press, the orchard, all of it. The feeling of inheriting something that had been kept up by people who'd understood, without fully articulating it, that some things were worth the trouble of maintaining correctly. The debt note was retired in full in November, 3 months ahead of schedule. She drove to Swift Current on a Tuesday morning and paid it in a single payment, in cash, and Beaumont counted it with the expression of someone who had adjusted his expectations more than once this year and was still in the process of adjusting. "Account settled," he said. "I know," she said, and took her receipt and walked out into the November morning, which was gray and cold with the first real snow of the season starting down off the Cypress Hills. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She'd thought in the winter that paying the note off would feel like the end of something. It felt instead like the point in a job where you've finished the hard foundation work and can see clearly, for the first time, what the structure is actually going to be. Not the end. The confirmation that the ground was solid. She drove back up the bench road in the light snowfall, past the Hartwick property, where 12 new trees stood in a row along the fence line waiting to be moved in the spring, past Agnes's gate with the hand-painted sign that hadn't changed in 40 years, up the last rise to the Sevidge gate, where the orchard was visible on the south slope, the trees holding their shape against the white. She parked in the yard and sat in the truck for a moment before she got out. Both root cellar vents were visible from here, and through them, very faint, the smell of fermentation on the cold air. Apple and yeast and oak, and something underneath all of it that she'd been chasing since August of the year before. The quality her great-aunt had called depth and had underlined once and never quite explained. She understood now that it couldn't be fully explained. It could be described in the terms she used in her notebook. It could be pointed to, tasted, recognized. But the understanding of it was not a thing that transferred cleanly from one person to another in language. It was the kind of understanding that required you to stand in the cold for a year and pay close attention to what was actually happening, rather than what you'd been told to expect. She got out of the truck. Oscar was in the orchard with a flagging tape, marking the locations where the heartwick trees would be transplanted in the spring. He'd worked out the spacing himself, factoring in the mature canopy size and the sun angle in February, and the plan he'd drawn up was more thorough than anything she would have designed without him. She hadn't told him that directly. She'd looked at the plan and asked a single follow-up question about spacing in the lowest row, and he'd answered it, and that had been enough. He was learning the same way she learned, by doing the thing and observing what happened and adjusting. She trusted that process. Gretchen was in the implement shed going through the pressing records for the season, logging the final yields against the notebook entries, a task Nora had started, and Gretchen had taken over somewhere in the late summer without either of them making a decision about it. She had her own notebook now, purchased from the same dollar store in Swift Current, green cover to Nora's red. Wren had called that morning about the November accounts. The numbers were better than projected, not extravagantly better, but better in the specific way that means the foundation is solid and the adjustments are working. There was money enough for the spring transplanting, for the 2 additional barrels she'd been considering, and for the pruning equipment Oscar had identified as necessary in his orchard improvement notes, and still enough remaining to begin the equipment fund. She'd decided to build toward a second press. Not this spring. Probably the following one. But the direction was clear. Rouge had written the previous week about 2 new restaurant accounts that had approached her after the chef at the Saskatoon hotel had mentioned the product to colleagues at an industry gathering. She'd asked Nora to confirm she could handle the additional allocation by the following harvest. Nora had confirmed yes, knowing it would be tight, and knowing that tight was manageable when the structure underneath it was sound. That evening she climbed the south slope the way she sometimes did at the end of a long day, past the orchard, up through the scrub aspen to the bench above the property, where you could see the full shape of the land spread out below. The snow had stopped. The air was clean and very cold. The lights of the root cellar were on, which meant Gretchen was still working, and the single bulb in the implement shed where Oscar had been inventorying the pressing supplies was visible through the small window. She stood up there for a while. She thought about the auction yard in October, the laughter that had followed her out to the road, the envelope in the kitchen drawer with just enough in it to cover the first pressing cloth order and 2 weeks of chicken feed. She thought about her great-aunt's receipts in their bundle and the underlined word in the production notes from 1967, and the cider her grandfather had kept in this same root cellar in jars without labels, because he hadn't needed labels to know what was in them. She thought about what it meant to inherit a piece of land from people who'd done things carefully for reasons they couldn't always articulate. What it meant to have nearly let that land go, to have come as close as she had to the point where the debt would have made the decision for her. She hadn't let it go. She'd held it and found in it what she'd believed was there, working from her great-aunt's receipts, and a room-temperature jar of sour apple juice, and a conviction she couldn't entirely defend in December that had turned out by November to be accurate. The valley below was beginning to go dark. The lights of Coldwater were visible to the south, the water tower, and the co-op elevator, and the long strip of the highway east. Up here on the bench, the cold pressed in from every side, and her breath made small clouds in the still air, and the smoke from the root cellar vent rose straight and patient in the windless evening, the way it would rise all winter. She stayed until the cold made staying impractical. Then she turned and came back down the way she'd come, through the orchard where the trees stood in the last gray light, through the yard where Gretchen's truck was still parked, past the implement shed where the press was stored clean and covered, and ready for the spring harvest that was already in planning. She went into the root cellar on her way to the house and checked the temperature and made a note in her red notebook and stood for a moment in the particular quiet of the stone room in the evening. The smell was right. The process was working. Everything that needed to continue was continuing. She went up into the kitchen, fed the stove, and sat down at the table with the production schedule for the coming year spread out in front of her. Faye would be back from her grandmother's on Friday. There was a section of the orchard plan she'd been meaning to show her, the part where the new trees would go in, and she wanted Faye to see it before Oscar started the staking in the spring. It seemed like something worth seeing. Outside, the snow had started again, soft and without wind, settling over the benchland and the orchard and the root cellar and the road that ran down to the valley, covering everything the way the first snow always covers things, patiently, without any opinion about what it finds underneath.